On the morning of December 16, 1944, a German spearhead came out of the fog in the Ardennes expecting to erase a tiny American outpost before breakfast. That outpost was not a fortress. It was not a veteran regiment. It was not even a full rifle company. It was a thin line of foxholes near Lanzerath, Belgium, held by a small intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Infantry Division, with a few artillery observers attached. The officer in charge, Lyle Bouck Jr., was barely old enough to buy a drink back home. Most of the men around him had never been in a real battle before. And walking toward them through the snow were German paratroopers from the lead elements of Hitler's last offensive in the West. Their job was simple. Crack the American line, open the road, clear a path for the armor behind them. By the arithmetic of war, the Americans should have disappeared in minutes. They did not. Bouck's men let the Germans come close enough for shape to become body, close enough for confidence to become exposure. Then the foxholes erupted. The first German assault folded in the field. Then another came, then another. Through the fog, through the cold, through the awful confusion of a battle. No one had warned these young Americans was coming. The scouts held. Hour after hour, a handful of green soldiers stopped a force that badly outnumbered them. When the Germans finally worked around them at dusk and forced the position to surrender, the damage had already been done. The road had been delayed, the timetable had been bruised, and the German commanders, looking at the casualties and the lost hours, believed there had to be more Americans hidden in the woods. There were not. That was the disturbing part. There had only been the men in those holes, and that is where the real question begins. Not whether Americans could be brave. Every army in history has met brave enemies. The question that bothered German veterans was stranger than that. How could men this new to combat behave as if they had already been hardened by it? How could a division the press would call the battle babies stand in the first hours of the Bulge and fight with the discipline of an older army? How could boys who had been clerks, farmhands, students, mechanics, and grocery stockers a year or two earlier become useful under fire almost immediately? To the German mind, that should not have been possible. Because the German army believed it knew how soldiers were made. And the American answer to that question was something Germany had never taken seriously until it was too late to understand the shock. You have to start before the shooting. Not in the Ardennes, not in Normandy, but in the old German idea of the soldier himself. For generations, German officers had treated military skill almost like a craft tradition. A real soldier was not produced quickly. He was grown. He learned inside a unit. He absorbed habits from older men. He watched sergeants who had been shaped by other sergeants. He inherited discipline, movement, field sense, and aggression from an institution that believed war was a profession, not an emergency job. There was truth in that belief. The German army did not become feared by accident. Its officer corps, staff system, training culture, and junior leadership were the product of long work. It had a language for war. It had a memory for war. It had men who could improvise under pressure because they had been raised inside a military culture that rewarded exactly that. So when Germans looked at the United States in the late 1930s, they did not see a hidden giant. They saw a wealthy civilian country with almost no serious army, a commercial republic, a place of factories, highways, advertisements, baseball, and paychecks. Not regiments, not a warrior caste, not a nation built around barracks and barracks thinking. And in 1939, the surface evidence seemed to prove them right. The United States Army was small. Its equipment was uneven. Its interwar budgets had been starved by a public that wanted no repeat of the slaughter of 1917 and 1918. Its posts were scattered, quiet, and thin. Against the Wehrmacht that crushed Poland and then France, The American army looked less like a rival than a delayed paperwork problem. The German mistake was not seeing American weakness. That weakness was real. The mistake was deciding what the weakness meant. Germany assumed that because the United States did not already possess a large veteran army, it could not quickly create a good one. That assumption came from the deepest German belief about soldiering. Quality took time. Quality required inheritance. Quality lived in old units and long service men. You could draft civilians by the million. Yes, you could give them uniforms. You could put rifles in their hands. But that only made an army in the shallowest sense. It did not make soldiers. That was the German model. The Americans were building a different model. Quietly, awkwardly at first, and on a scale almost no one outside the United States understood. The man most associated with that training machine was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces. He was not a battlefield celebrity. He did not have the theatrical fame of Patton or MacArthur. But he faced one of the hardest problems any army had ever faced. How do you take a small peacetime force and turn it into millions of men who can fight before the war is already over? You cannot do it the German way. There are not enough old professionals. There are not enough veteran sergeants. There is not enough institutional time. So the American answer was brutal, practical, and very modern. Do not wait for experience to seep slowly into a man. Break the soldier's job into teachable parts. Standardize those parts. Write them down. Build training centers large enough to process the country. Then push civilians through a deliberate sequence until the army from Alabama to California is teaching the same basic combat language. The German soldier was supposed to be formed inside tradition. The American soldier would be built inside a system. Across the United States, replacement training centers and division camps became the hidden factories of the war. They did not produce tanks or artillery shells. They produced habits: how to move under fire, how to dig, how to use cover, how to fire and maneuver, how to recognize the voice of an order in chaos, how to crawl while live rounds snapped overhead, how to keep thinking when fear tried to take the wheel. The training cycle lengthened as the army learned. Early shortcuts were exposed. More field work was added. More fire realism was added. The system was not perfect, but it did something Germany had not imagined at this scale. It learned as a machine learns. A mistake in one place could become an instruction in another. A weakness found in a maneuver could become a new drill. A lesson bought with fear and bruises on one training ground could be written, copied, taught, and repeated across the country. Camp Roberts in California trained hundreds of thousands of men. Other camps in Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Florida, and beyond did the same work. They were not glamorous places. They were dusty, crowded, repetitive, exhausting. But that was the point. The old armies of Europe imagined soldierly competence as something stored in veterans. America began storing it in procedures, manuals, schedules, ranges, instructors, standard tasks, shared doctrine. A recruit could arrive at a unit without having survived a campaign, yet still carry the same basic field language as the men around him. That did not make him fearless. It did not make him elite. It did not remove the terror of the first shell burst. But it meant that when the first shell burst came, he was not completely empty. He had rehearsed fragments of the moment before the moment became real. And that difference mattered. Still, no training system proves itself on paper. It proves itself when a professional enemy tears into it, and the first verdict was ugly. In February 1943, in Tunisia, the U.S. the Second Corps collided with German and Italian forces in the fighting around Kasserine Pass. The Americans were raw. Their commanders were uneven. Their units were spread badly. Coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support broke down. The terrain punished confusion. The enemy punished it harder. Kasserine was a humiliation. American units gave ground. Men were captured. Equipment was lost. Reports moved faster than control. To British observers, German officers, and many Americans themselves, the lesson seemed obvious. The United States had produced quantity, not quality. The factory had made armed civilians, and when those civilians met a hardened army, they bent. But this is where the American system revealed its most dangerous feature. It could be corrected. The defeat was not treated as a shame to be hidden inside tradition. It was treated as data. Commanders were removed. Procedures were revised. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air cooperation were hammered harder. The army pulled the broken pieces apart, studied the fracture, and changed the way it fought. That is not poetic. That is not heroic in the way battlefield stories usually sound. But it may have been one of the most important American talents of the war. The ability to lose a lesson, name the lesson, and distribute the lesson quickly. Within weeks, American units in North Africa were fighting with visibly more competence. By the time the campaign moved on, German assessments of American performance had become far less dismissive. They had seen something that did not fit the old model. A force that could arrive clumsy, take a beating, and become dangerous with startling speed. Not because its men had suddenly acquired years of tradition, because the institution behind them could absorb impact and push the correction forward. This is the key to the whole story. The green American soldier did not become a veteran in a day. No one does. Kasserine proved that. Lanzerath proved something else. It proved that a man could arrive at his first battle already carrying enough training, enough shared procedure, enough basic combat language, that the final hardening under fire could happen terrifyingly fast. The Germans had expected rawness to mean helplessness. Instead, they found rawness wrapped around preparation. That was new, and it was deeply unsettling, because if soldierly quality could be engineered upstream, then Germany's oldest advantage was not as permanent as Germany believed. But the American machine had a cruel side. The word soldiers hated was Repel-Depel, replacement depot. It sounds almost comic until you understand what it meant. A rifle company at the front burned through men faster than almost any organization behind it could emotionally survive. The dead and wounded left holes. The holes had to be filled. The U.S. Army often filled them not by withdrawing whole shattered units and rebuilding them as families, but by sending individual replacements forward. 1 man, then 3, then 15. Names on a roster, moved through depots, shipped toward companies that had already formed their private world of grief, jokes, fear, superstition, and loss. For the replacement, it could be brutal. He might have trained hard in the States, then waited in a depot long enough for his edge to dull. He might be moved like cargo from one holding point to another. Then in darkness or mud or shellfire, he would be delivered to a veteran unit that did not know him, and often did not want to know him. Not out of cruelty alone, out of self-protection. Old hands had watched too many new men arrive and vanish. Learning a new name could feel like making a promise the war would break by morning. So the replacement entered combat at the worst possible angle. Alone among men who already belonged to one another. Sometimes he was under fire within a day or two. That was the American system at its coldest. Efficient on a chart, savage in a foxhole. And many men died in those first days because training, however good, could not replace belonging. A soldier needs skill. He also needs a unit that sees him before the enemy does. The army eventually recognized parts of this damage, and tried to return wounded men to their old outfits more often when it could. But the replacement system remained one of the great human costs of American efficiency. So the answer to German confusion is not that the American way was flawless. It was not. It made strong soldiers. It also sometimes fed those soldiers into battle with a loneliness that no manual could fix. And while America wrestled with the flaws of mass production, Germany was losing the very thing its own model required: veterans. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht had been cut open in the East, battered in Italy, and mauled in France. The Long Service Corps, the old reservoir of hard-won competence, was being drained faster than Germany could refill it. So Germany began improvising. New formations appeared with names meant to sound fierce, and National Volksgrenadier Divisions, People's Grenadier Divisions. The label carried pride. The contents often carried desperation. Teenagers, older men, convalescents, men transferred from the Luftwaffe or Navy, fragments of shattered units, a few veterans trying to stiffen too many newcomers. Sometimes they were given excellent infantry weapons, sometimes morale was high, sometimes they fought hard. But the contradiction was impossible to miss. Germany, the army that had insisted real soldiers had to be grown slowly, was now rushing men into battle in weeks because there was no time left. The country that mocked manufactured soldiers was trying to manufacture them at the end of a war it was losing, and it was doing it under bombs, shortages, panic, and collapse. America had built its training machine before the crisis reached the shoreline. Germany tried to improvise one after the crisis had already entered the room. That was the difference. Now return to the Ardennes. Return to the fog, the pine trees, the frozen fields, and the roads the Germans needed desperately. The American divisions holding quiet sectors were supposed to be easy meat. The 99th Infantry Division had only recently arrived in Europe. It had not been seasoned in Italy. It had not been blooded across Normandy. It was stretched across a line far too wide for comfort, because Allied commanders believed the Ardennes was a resting sector. Then the 6th Panzer Army struck. The attack was meant to tear open the northern shoulder of the Bulge, seize roads, and release armor into operational space. Against that plan stood formations Germany expected to fold. The 99th did not fold. It was hit, cut, bent, and forced back in places. But it did not dissolve. At Lanzerath, a handful of scouts stole time. At other points along the front, Green Americans gave ground slowly enough, stubbornly enough, and violently enough to damage the timetable of the entire offensive. Then came the high ground around Elsenborn Ridge. There, American defenders turned frozen earth into a wall. German infantry and armor came again and again. Artillery smashed the ridge. Tanks probed for weakness. Men who had been in combat for only days learned the battlefield at a speed that would have seemed impossible in a classroom. They learned where the German fire fell. They learned which draws mattered. They learned how to stay low, where to shift, when to wait, when to call for artillery, when not to run. And because the American army had built a shared combat language before they ever reached Belgium, the learning had something to attach to. The lesson did not fall into empty space. It hit prepared structure. That is why the Germans were puzzled. Not because the Americans were superhuman. Not because training made them immune to fear. The snow around Elsenborn was full of fear. The replacement depots were full of fear. The retreat roads after Kasserine had been full of fear. The difference was that fear did not always erase function. The young American soldier might shake, swear, vomit, freeze, or pray. But he often still knew the next small military thing to do: dig, cover, fire, move, call, hold, wait, report. Those simple verbs were the product. Not parade, ground polish, not mythology. Function under terror. That is what the Americans... And when enough men carried those verbs into the same frozen line, the line could become far stronger than its age suggested. The German veteran looked for the explanation he understood. Long tradition. Old units. A lifetime in uniform. A military caste. A hidden reserve of seasoned men. He did not find it. He found boys from Ohio, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Georgia, California, and farms and factories all over the country. He found divisions that had barely arrived. He found lieutenants younger than many German sergeants. He found men who should have been empty of war experience, and were not empty of military preparation. That was the part his model could not digest. Germany had believed soldiers were grown like oak trees. America had treated soldier, making like an engineering problem. And for all the waste, cruelty, failures, and hard lessons inside that system, it worked well enough to change what green meant. Green no longer meant useless. Green could mean unfinished. It could mean frightened. It could mean untested. But it did not have to mean helpless. That was the shock waiting in the Ardennes. A new American division could be inexperienced and still be structurally dangerous. A replacement could be lonely and still carry a standardized skill set. A humiliated army could be beaten in February and fighting differently by March. A country dismissed as soft could move from civilian life to battlefield competence. Not through ancient martial tradition, but through scale, discipline, paperwork, live fire, correction, and an industrial seriousness about training. The Germans were not confused by courage. They had seen courage everywhere. They were confused by trained courage, appearing where their theory said it should not exist. They were confused by competence without ancestry. They were confused by an army that could make mistakes, revise itself, and send the revision forward. By 1945, the irony was complete. Germany was rushing trained boys and old men into formations with proud names, trying to do in desperation what America had built deliberately. The old model had run out of old soldiers. The new model had produced enough trained young ones to keep learning in the fire. And on ridges like Lanzerath and Elsenborn, the difference became visible in snow. The men of the 99th were not legends when they arrived. They became proof. Proof that a soldier does not have to be inherited from the past before he can matter in the present. Proof that training, if built seriously enough, can put discipline into a man before experience has time to carve it there. Proof that the first battle does not have to be the first lesson. The German army had spent generations believing real soldiers could only be grown. America showed them something colder, newer, and harder to explain. A soldier could also be made, and when the making was done well enough, even the men who had never seen combat could step into the fog, hold the line, and make veterans wonder where they had come from.